we're going to look at chaff flower, ID, ecology, and distribution. So just to start, we're talking about Japanese chaff flower. It's Acaranthes japonica. And that the common name Japanese chaff flower is literally just a transliteration of the scientific name, which means that it's a chaff flower from Japan. There are multiple varieties of Japanese chaff flower out there. It appears that everything we have in North America is the same variety, which kind of lends weight to the idea that it all started from a single introduction, potentially. Chaff flower is in the Amaranthaceae family, the amaranth family. And there's actually 3 congeners in that same Acaranthes genus here in North America. One is aspera, Acaranthes aspera. It is called devil's horsewhip or something like that. It's also an exotic, and it's escaped along the Gulf Coast and parts of the Atlantic coast. We'll talk about how to tell those apart here in a little bit. And then there's actually 2 native Acaranthes in Hawaii. But in the most of the region that we're talking about today, when you get out of the Gulf Coast or parts of the Atlantic coast, this is the only Acaranthes that we're dealing with. So chaff flower is a perennial herbaceous forb. It can be 2 to 5 feet tall, although sometimes it can get a little taller. It can be starts as a multiple or a single stem plant, and as it gets older, the plants tend to form multiple stems that come out of the same root system. You're looking for opposite entire leaves with very arcing venation on them. We'll look at some pictures in a bit. The stems are stout. They have inflated reddish nodes, and the flowers, the flower heads are kind of a bottle brush like. They start really short and compact at first, and they elongate as the season wears on, and they start forming fruit from those flowers. As the fruit are formed, they deflex and lay flat along the stem, and they have a pair of bracts, each fruit does, from the base. That also helps in its spread, and we'll look at that in a little bit as well. And even in the winter, this plant has bright tan thatch, which makes it easily identifiable. The leaves kind of melt away a little bit, but the stems and the fruiting stems all remain, and you can see them throughout the winter. So let's look at some pictures of it. So this is a couple pictures taken just a couple days ago here in Southern Illinois. And you can see those opposite leaves, the entire leaves, they're not serrated or anything on the edge, and the small bottle brush flowers. So there are a few plants that look like this. So we're going to go kind of into detail from each of these characteristics. And so if you're looking at just the leaves, again, you can see that they're clearly opposite. They have entire leaves, so there's no serrations, no indentations or anything along the edge. They may have a bit of a wavy edge to them. But to me, the veins on these leaves are very prominent, easily seen, and they're noticeably arching or arcing, kind of that arcuate venation. It really jumps out to me. It looks like either superficially like a basil plant, or it looks like a flowering dogwood seedling when it's not flowering like this. So that to me is really kind of what these leaves can most look like. Just a couple more looks at that. Very, very prominent venation, again, entire leaves. And the coloration can change a little bit. Sometimes it can almost have a reddish purple tinge to the leaves. Other times they're just bright green. If you look at the nodes, so the stems themselves typically are a hefty stem on them. They're almost squarish in cross section, but the nodes, so where the either branch, where the plant branches or the leaves come out, those nodes are often inflated a little bit, so they're a little broader right there. And many times they have a reddish coloration to them, either in the leaf petioles or actually the stem at the nodes. You can see that it varies quite a bit. The one on the left has kind of a dull purple coloration. The one on the right is very red. You can even find some that have no red coloration. So it does vary quite a bit. But those inflated nodes, that squarish stem, and if that reddish coloration is present, are really good indicators. So older plants, like I said, tend to be multiple stemmed. So if you were to dig this plant up, those two stems coming out of the ground there would be connected to the same root system. Older plants also tend to branch very low to the ground, and so you'll have very large side branches coming out of a single stem, and so you'll have, it looks like a big robust plant. You'll have multiple flowering stems that look like there's many plants kind of crowded in, but once you get to the ground and look at them, it's the same plant. Often those lower stems are very thickened, larger, bigger than a pencil for sure, inflated as well, and then often has a reddish coloration to it. When it's not flowering, many times this plant kind of fades into the background and it's hard to pick it out or identify it unless you're familiar with it. When it's not flowering, it almost kind of looks like a lot of other plants, and so it can be a challenge. When it is flowering, these bottle brush-like flowers really stand out. So when they start blooming, and they'll bloom kind of late summer. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the flowers are very, very compact. It's tight green flowers and a tight, compact little spike. Very short at first, and you can see here. And then over time, they actually do tend to elongate. But it really, really jumps out to me is this, this bottle brush kind of look to them. So you can see more of it here. This one on the right is starting to elongate a little bit. And this is usually what you'll see, where you have at the top of the spike, you'll have newly developing flowers. They're closed, they're not open yet. And then you'll have a band somewhere close to the bottom of open flowers. And you can see there's 3 or 4 open flowers right here on this particular one. And then below the open flowers, as they're pollinated, they tend to close and they start forming fruit, and then they'll deflex and start laying along the stem. So you'll often have kind of all 3 situations on the same flowering spike: newly formed, unopened flowers, open flowers, and closing flowers or developing fruit altogether. As this happens, the stem goes from that tight, compact look to a much more elongated one. Just another look here. On the left is a young flower spike for Japanese chaff flower, and you can see a number of those flowers are open, where they'll have the 5 green petals. You see the stamens and the pistil in the middle there. Really, really hard to see that unless you look for it. Oftentimes you're just looking for that bottle brush. These kind of get lost in there. The one on the right there is the same plant. I just pulled all the other flowers off so I could take a picture of one flower. But the interesting thing is, even when it's flowering, these little paired spikes, these bracts, are present kind of behind the flower. You can see the flowering spike itself is often pretty hairy as well. But here are the flowering spikes as they're starting to mature into fruit. And you can see they really do start to elongate. They may be an inch or so less in length at the start. When they finish, they may be 1.5 feet long. So they really do elongate. And again, you've got the developing flowers at the top, open flowers kind of in the middle, and then closed flowers and forming fruit kind of at the bottom. This will continue on as the plant continues to elongate its flowering spike until you have just a couple little flowers at the top, and then the rest of the spike is elongated and covered in fruit. The fruit themselves are small, pointed fruit. Again, they deflex and they lay flat along the stem. And then they have these paired bracts that come out from the back of them. Again, this really aids in spread. Those paired bracts will grab onto fur, clothing, things like that. And it's important to realize that these bracts, these little spikes, come out from the back of the fruit. There is we'll look at it in a minute, but there is a close look-alike that has some spikes on it that come out from the end of the fruit, the front end of the fruit. And that's a way to tell it apart, is the location of these little spiky bracts. Just another look at it there. This one, particular one here, is kind of got a purplish coloration. That's not always the case. Many times they can be just green in color. When they dry down, they'll be, of course, brown. But in early fall or mid-fall, once the plant is finished flowering, it really jumps out as an easier plant to identify because of those tall, elongated fruiting stems at that point in time. It really makes the plant have a different feel, and can turns into one of those plants that you can identify just driving by it at that point. It really really makes it stand out. And like I mentioned before, when the plant fades away in the winter, often the leaves will die down, but the stems will remain standing. You can still see the fruiting stalks on it still, even at that time of year. And then here's a look of a bunch of it like that. So it really does jump out to you that way. Like even in the wintertime, that kind of bright yellow or bright tan coloration to it, along with the fruiting spikes at the top of the plant, jump out to you. Now, if you're in an area that has significant amount of snow, what we've seen is snow cover will knock these down often and break them and have them lay on the ground. Or if you're in an area where there's a lot of flooding, that'll happen as well. So you may not always find this in the winter. In every situation, the plants may be laying along the ground and less visible in the winter. But absent of a lot of flooding or siltation, and absent of heavy snow cover, you'll see this a lot in the winter. And again, in the wintertime, those fruiting stems and the fruit themselves really stand out. If you happen to pass by this and brush up against it, it is easy to identify just by what's left on your clothes here. So these are a lot of those chaff flower fruit hanging on to my shirt. When the plants are young, they're usually not as thickened, so the stems are a little thin. The one on the left is a young plant. It's just a single stem with a very short flowering stalk. You'll see them like that. As they age, they'll get more robust. The plants will thicken. They'll get multiple branching from the stalk, so you'll have multiple kind of leaders coming up. And then you'll also get separate stems coming out of the ground from the same root system. You can see here on the right, it's a much more thickened stem, a larger plant, multiple flowering spikes coming out as compared to the young plant on the left. The seedlings, an abundant seed producer can produce a ton of seedlings, as you see here. But still, even with them, you're looking for somewhat of that reddish coloration at the nodes, as well as the opposite leaves and those arching venation that really are prominent. So in this picture here, the majority of what you're looking at is chaff flower seedlings. There's some over here on the right. These little ones here are Japanese honeysuckle, and you can see the venation is very, very different. The coloration is different. And then we have some other plants up here that are different, but by and large, you see these arching veins on them, the prominently opposite leaves, and it really stands out. So even in a seedling stage, you can tell that they're chaff flower. This is a look of a stand that is just before flowering, just to see what a big patch of it looks like. And again, you can really see that those leaf characteristics jump out to you even in a large stand like this. When it's not as near of a monoculture like this and it's mixed in with a lot of other tall plants, they can be difficult to pick out. They kind of, since they're dull green, there's basic leaf shape, they can be easy to miss. Of course, when they're fruiting, they're much easier to pick out. So let's just review that again. The identification characteristics. We just saw all these pictures. Again, it's a perennial herbaceous forb, so it lives a long time, but it dies back to the ground each fall. 2 to 5 feet tall on average. You can certainly have shorter plants, and you can certainly have some taller plants in the right situation. As they age, they go from a thin single-stemmed plant to multiple stems and multiple branches of those plants in a much more robust, thickened plant. You're looking for those leaves with opposite arrangement, entire edges, that really prominent venation that's arching or arcing, almost like a common buckthorn or a flowering dogwood leaf. The stems are stout, inflated, and reddish at the nodes. And then you're looking for that bottle brush-like flower head. It's very compact at first, and as we've seen, it really elongates as it switches to fruiting. The fruit deflects, lay flat along the stem. It's a small pointed fruit with these paired bracts that arise from the base of the fruit. And then in winter, it's a bright tan thatch. The leaves will die back and are less visible, but the stems remain often throughout winter. So a couple lookalikes that we have around here, particularly in the fruiting stage, is lopseed, so Phryma. So when it has its leaves on, it's pretty easy. The leaves are opposite, just like chaff flower, but they're very obviously serrated. So that is an easy way to tell them apart. But the fruiting spike does look very similar. And so that could be in the winter or late season when the leaves are senescing and gone. You could easily mistake lopseed for chaff flower. But what you want to look for is, if you see these, they have these little pointy spiked parts of it are coming from the end of the fruit instead of the base of the fruit. And then also the fruit tend to be opposite on lopseed, where they tend to alternate along the stem with chaff flower. But really that location of the spikes, or the pokey parts of the fruit, whether it's on the front like in lopseed or the back like in chaff flower, that's really how to tell them apart the easiest when they're fruiting. Earlier in the year, it's pretty easy with the leaf serrations. Now, since since chaff flower is making its way south, we're getting some of it down the Mississippi. We'll talk about that in a minute. There is an opportunity to have, potentially in the future, both of those exotic acanthes together in the same place. And so again, there's the devil's horsewhip, Acanthes aspera, which is along the Gulf Coast, and then Japanese chaff flower, Acanthes japonica. They do look a lot alike, very similar in the vegetative states. The devil's horsewhip aspera tends to have more purple coloration to its flowers and its fruit, whereas japonica tends to be more uniform green in color, but both of those are variable. When it's flowering, the easiest way to tell them apart would be to look actually at the flowers. And so these little things in between the stamens are called pseudostaminoids. And on Japanese chaff flower, they're either entire or they've got kind of like 2 major lobes on them. Whereas on the aspera, if you look at that area in between the stamens, they have what's called fimbriate pseudostaminoids, which basically means they're kind of fleshy and feathery coming out. It looks like the stipules on a multiflora rose petiole, if you will. So that really is a big difference between the two. So if anybody's in the far south, and you may eventually get into that intergrade zone between the 2 exotic species, that's the easiest way to tell them apart. In terms of timing of this plant, that's going to vary a lot depending on where it is and where you're at in its range. So what I have here is kind of for the lower Midwest, the Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky area. But again, you may have to adjust that depending on where you're at. Overall, chaff flower has a very long germination window. So we see new germinates coming up anytime from spring, really through midsummer. So it seems like there's not a flush or a period where you have all the germination. Those seeds will kind of germinate throughout the growing season quite a bit. Flowering around here typically starts in late summer. So sometimes in late July, usually it's that first week or two in August is when we really see flowering starting here in the lower Midwest. Flowering will continue, and then you'll see the fruit being produced kind of throughout the rest of the late summer into the early fall. And then maybe early to mid fall is when you see the fruit starting to mature, starting to get ripe. And then the whole plant starts to senesce kind of mid even to late fall. So October, late October, something like that in the Midwest is where you'll see it starting to brown up, usually sometime around the first frost, maybe even into early November. Again, this varies a lot depending on where you're at. These are just kind of the averages for here. In terms of what this plant prefers for habitat, I think it tends to prefer moist, well-drained, kind of rich bottomland soils. So you'll see it do really, really well in riparian areas and bottomland forest, though it does not like to have wet feet. So areas that have extended periods of inundation, lots of flooding, wetland soils, true wetland soils, I don't think the plant does well in those situations. You typically don't see it there. But well-drained, rich bottomland soils, it seems to really, really grow well and do well there. Though I will add that this plant can grow nearly anywhere. Even though it prefers that kind of soil, we've seen it all the way from the driest of the dry areas, full sun to really deep shade, all of this. So it does grow nearly anywhere. It tends to prefer that kind of edge habitat, and it really likes disturbed sites. So we see a lot of it in roadsides, field edges, forest edges, fence rows, even yards, flower beds, old fields. It really has a very, very wide spectrum of where it can grow. And so this is an edge of a field and forest border in a bottomland situation where the plant's doing really, really well. You can see it's growing robustly here. This is a roadside ditch where it's growing in full sun and doing really well. Flower beds, seems to be okay. Even cracks in sidewalk or edges of yards, kind of a yard weed as well. And then in that more traditional, this is kind of a traditional upland forest. So a little drier, a little poorer soils, it's still doing well. Kind of old, disturbed, planted pine plantations, roadsides, more pine plantations here. Again, very, very wide habitat preferences. It seems it's able to grow in a lot of different places. Here's some floral associates, and again, this should be taken really with a grain of salt because it grows in such a wide area that it'll have a lot of other plants it's associated with. So this is more of what we see around here where we see these really big infestations where it does really well. You'll see it growing near or close to things like jewelweed, stinging nettle, wood nettles, clearweed, white snake root, spice bush, Virginia jumpseed, all of those. Often growing with other invaders like Japanese stiltgrass, garlic mustard, Japanese hops, beefsteak plant. But again, it's such a wide habitat tolerances that it can grow throughout the spectrum. These are just the ones that we commonly see the big infestations growing near. In terms of reproduction, that's going to be addressed later, but just to know it has a very, very high seed production, very high germination rate as well. So it produces a ton of seed. In terms of how they spread, it seems to be spread kind of chiefly in two different ways. One is water spread, and that's very clear if you look at how it spreads along waterways. And we'll show that in a minute, how quickly it spread down the Ohio River system. but also spread via animals or humans. And so I think we spread it around. It's local spread, kind of hitchhiking like that. But then flood waters seem to be the major way for some of these longer distance spreads down a single watershed. So here's just a couple pictures of, again, of my shirt and my coat that has some chaff flower seeds hitchhiking. I love showing this picture of my brother's dog with chaff flower seeds all stuck in its hair. So very easy to move around that way. We're going to have a talk a lot more on the kind of animal stuff here in a bit, but just to mention it here. So what are those high risk situations where you're likely to find Japanese chaff flower showing up? One, I think, is recreational areas, because it's so easy to pick up on clothing, on shoelaces, anything like that. People have a real potential to move it around. So I think anywhere where there's a lot of recreation and people coming from out of area to visit. So campgrounds, hunting areas, hiking trails, fishing trails along streams that may have chaff flower along it, horse riding areas, all of those represent a pretty high risk situation to either pick up chaff flower or find it for the first time as people are moving it into the area. Locally, roadside mowing, particularly in forested areas where you have forested roadsides, is a really, really high risk situation for mowing and spreading chaff flower locally. And then anywhere that's kind of downstream spread. So streamside infestations, if you're in a watershed that has Japanese chaff flower, it's very, very likely to move down those watersheds, move down the streams with floodwaters and spread that way. In terms of surveying for this plant and looking for it, I think there's some opportunities out there, some citizen scientist opportunities with smartphone app reporting like the EdMaps app, because it is so visible, especially late summer, early fall, hiking trails looking for it, driving along roadsides in the right habitat, particularly looking at bridges over kind of bottomland hardwoods. We did a lot of survey initially in Illinois from a boat looking for this when we were mapping it. So we got in a boat on the Ohio River, drove down and stopped in kind of slightly higher forested areas along the river, walked in and found chaff flower that way. And that's what this picture is. So we, looking for Japanese chaff flower, we had several other invaders, these silver carp, land in our boat while we were doing these boating surveys. But these surveys can be probably most useful late summer through early fall, but even in the winter time, because of that thatch, you could certainly find it. In terms of where this is native to, it's native to Japan and also has populations on the Korean Peninsula. And we'll see these pictures later too, but just a couple pictures of chaff flower growing in Japan, which I think was kind of neat. But this is the article that kind of detailed the first find of this plant in North America. And so it was first reported in 1981 was first found, but 1985 the article came out. And so it was found in Warfield, Kentucky, in far eastern Kentucky in Martin County, along the Tug Fork River, in between the river and the railroad tracks. So that's kind of the first location that this was reported from in all of North America. How it got there and why it got there is still somewhat of a mystery. But this is actually a picture here from the banks of the Tug Fork River, and you can see a big population here of chaff flower all over that. This is what the habitat looks like there. You can see it's very, very topographically variable, a lot of hills and mountainous terrain. There's a river that runs, the Tug Fork River runs through there, and the railroad tracks run through there. So it's a funny place to show up at first. But we think it probably got there maybe hitchhiking on the railroad cars is how it first showed up. This is what the Tug Fork looks like in case you're interested. And also if you see this picture on the left, all of that plant that's growing all along the Tug Fork, that's all Japanese knotweed here. But again, beautiful river. In case you're interested, it is also a wonderful smallmouth river. This is my boy with a couple of his catches from the Tug Fork. I always got to sneak a picture in of my kids when I can. And so it has spread rapidly since the early 80s when it was first found, and moved its way down the Ohio River, down the Tug Fork into the Big Sandy, and from the Big Sandy into the Ohio, and from the Ohio down into the Mississippi River. So it's fairly rapidly made its way down these watersheds, and we're starting to see spread outside of that that system as well. So again, first found in 1981 in Eastern Kentucky. Now it's found in 11 different states and one province. You can see the states listed there. That represents 75 different counties, and there's 725 records for chaff flower in EDMAPS and 254 North American observations of chaff flower in iNaturalist. So fairly rapid spread. I'm guaranteed that that's much not up to date and underreported. I know it's much wider spread than even we know, but still it's quite surprising just how fast this plant is spread. So let's spend a minute here just looking at the spread kind of and highlighting the speed of it. So 1981 here, 1982, this is from the same paper where the same authors that first found it came back and found a couple more spots, including into West Virginia. 1984, they were still finding that. By 92, it was found in Ohio. 95, still found in a few more spots. By 2002, it showed up into Indiana and other parts of Kentucky, so you can see it making its way down. 2003, 4, it's expanding its known range. And then 2006 was the first time it was found outside of that Ohio River watershed down in southeastern Kentucky. By 2008, it was found in Illinois. 2009 was the first record I could find of it in Georgia, though I'm sure it was there much earlier than that. I don't doubt that had been in Georgia for years before 2009. And then 2010 is when we really started looking for it in earnest. You can see that a lot of the map filled in. Then we got that Alabama and Tennessee population. 2011, we found it in Missouri on the Mississippi River system, and then continued to fill in from there. 2015 really started jumping down the Mississippi River. By 2019, I believe, is when they found it in Ontario, still down the Mississippi River, and then 20, and now we're at here in 21. So again, in 40 years, this plant has really covered a lot of ground. Where is it going next? It's already likely present in every county adjacent to the Ohio River that's downstream of that eastern border of Ohio, Kentucky. I would imagine that we don't have records for it in every county, but I'm sure it's there. I would imagine we'll have continued spread down the Mississippi River, and eventually it'll meet up with the other Acranthes down there. We'll see these satellite populations outside of the Ohio Mississippi River system continue to grow. We'll see expansion from existing populations with animals, water, and humans. But I do think there's some opportunity for long distance spread events, some with birds potentially, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but also human-aided dispersal. And the reason I think that that's a high potential is, at least in Illinois, we're seeing chaff flowers show up in some of our highly visited recreation areas. So areas people come to view, to hike. We're seeing chaff flower in these locations. And so the potential to pick up chaff flower by out-of-staters or people from out of the region and then move it to new areas is pretty high. In terms of impacts, we'll have a talk later really looking more about kind of what's happening with chaff flower and its speed of growth and things. But just observationally, we know it forms dense, often near monoculture populations. It has the potential to displace native species and dominate ecosystems. So here is a video, hopefully it'll play, of just one of the infestations here at the Ag Center where I work, just so you can see just the extent of an infestation. One of the things that's interesting is that this plant does get browsed pretty heavily by deer. You can see all the stems browsed here, which is a little different than a lot of our other invaders, which are typically unpalatable. So finishing up here, in 2014, the USDA APHIS did a weed risk assessment for the species. Their conclusion from there is that it represented a high risk for being a major invader. And so in that publication, they had a predicted distribution of where chaff flower has the potential to grow. You can see they indicated pretty much entirely throughout the eastern US, even pockets of the Pacific Northwest as well. And then if you look at their scoring, the black box here was the chaff flower score from their weed risk assessment, and it was right in line with a lot of the other major invaders that they used for this. They used this system on, and so it was pretty high scored. Seems to indicate that there's a high potential for this species to really become a problem. In terms of where it's regulated or where it's listed as an invader, the Kentucky EPSI lists it as a severe threat. The Georgia EPSI considers it a Category 1 alert species, though in 2009, Georgia DNR and the Georgia Invasive Species Advisory Committee at that point in time labeled it as a low priority or not present in the state. So it was just getting there. It seems like a different system has rated it higher. It's a watch list A, which is the higher priority for Alabama by their Invasive Plant Council. Indiana listed as a prohibited plant that has a high invasion rank. New York listed as a prohibited plant. Wisconsin is prohibited with their NR40 law. And Ohio has it listed on their assessment process as potentially invasive, pending further review. So in summary, again, you're looking for this plant, you're looking for opposite entire leaves with arching venation, stout stems, inflated and reddish at the nodes, that bottle brush flower head that elongates as the fruit set, looking for that fruit with paired bracts that the fruit deflects to lay flat along the stem. This plant has wide habitat tolerances, really has the potential to grow nearly anywhere, though it does prefer bottomland soils and partial sun. It was first found in the early 80s in eastern Kentucky, and it has since spread throughout pretty much the entire lower Ohio River Valley and into the Mississippi River drainage. And we're seeing disjunct populations outside of that in Ontario, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. And we see that this has a high potential for human-aided dispersal. So really, it could show up pretty much anywhere.